Hello and welcome to our series of tutorials about Agile, Lean, Scrum, Kanban and so on. Today I would like to talk a little bit about backlog refinement, a very important meeting in the Scrum and Kanban processes, and one of the, in my opinion, one of the not misunderstood, but at least meetings that run completely wrong in most Agile implementations. Why? Because the backlog refinement meeting was created by us Scrum coaches in the beginning to create a proper backlog. So we had a long list of backlog items, and in the beginning of these long lists of backlog items, the problem was when the product owner started to talk to the teams had a huge amount of questions about these, about the backlog items. And there's an old saying of Ken Schwaber who said, never a product owner should show up in a sprint planning one meeting without a proper estimated and proper prioritized backlog. So, but when and how does the product owner prioritize his product backlog? Well, in the beginning, we believed the product owner can do that on the fly, in his office, sitting in a corner and thinking very hard and prioritize his product backlog. But we figured out that not really works. One issue was that in the beginning, we believed the teams have to estimate the backlog items based on the amount of work that has to go into these product backlog items. So tools were created like planning poker to estimate product backlog items or user stories in the later phases. But basically the issue stayed, we needed a meeting to talk with each other. And over the time, that meeting evolved from a backlog estimation meeting where the developers tell the product owner how much work they need to put into these backlogs, in a completely different idea about how to run a backlog refinement meeting. And some coaches still do it differently, then I will explain it in this short tutorial, but it's my way to do it this way. So let's first look a little bit back into the structure of Scrum or Kanban processes. So you have basically a couple of meetings on a tactical level. So you have your sprint planning 1 meeting, the SP1, and then you have the sprint planning 2, SP2. Then you have your daily scrums, and then you say we will have a review meeting and a retrospective meeting to talk about what we can improve in one of the next iterations. But how do you know that the team will be able to build a specific feature in the time frame of a sprint? And what is the typical, a good way for preparation of user stories for sprint planning 1? And a lot of people believed, and that was the reason why we created that, you need a kind of a meeting to talk from product owner to the development team about a specific story. So we put the backlog into that meeting, and then we started talking about the backlog items from the top to the bottom. Then we made a very interesting observation. This meeting started to take more and more time. It became longer and longer meetings. So we started to play planning poker for hours, and we had discussions and differences about the way user stories have to be developed. And that problem needed to be solved. So we came up with an idea that is very simple to use, and I will explain how matching estimation works in a different meeting. But we used matching estimation to change the way of estimation in this meeting. We started to think about why not talking about a size of a backlog item instead of how much work will go into that backlog item. So the basic idea was, how can we identify how large the scope of a feature is in a very simple way, and the solution was magic estimation, but that is the basic purpose. So we are talking about the size of a feature instead of the amount of work that goes into that backlog item. And what typically happens now is that by talking about the size, so how much functionality is in a specific user story, the team starts to think with the product owner in terms of functionality and not in terms of implementation. So the basic idea is we want to have a discussion about the basic functionality, and we will figure out if there is a huge amount of functionality built or a small amount of functionality built. And over time, you will see that large amount of functionalities needs a long time typically to build by a development team, and small amount of functionalities needs a larger amount of time for a development team. Smaller amounts needs a smaller amount of time functionality. So, and that is the way we structure now, we structure the purpose of the backlog refinement. So we talk about the size of the functionality features in terms of how much functionality is in that meeting, and then we use the sprint planning 1 after we know what is the right order to discuss very detailed about what exactly is within that functionality that we have to develop. So what kind of special toggles and dongles and whatever you need to build on this functionality is in that specific user story. Okay. One comment on things that I see in nature, in Scrum nature, so to say. A lot of people still use estimation or backlog refinement meeting in a different way. They say, we really need to understand exactly what is in that feature so that we can now estimate the duration of the time. And what they do is basically they do the work of sprint planning 1 in that backlog refinement meeting. And then they go in sprint planning 1 and say, okay, we know our capacity of the sprint is 42 story points, and if the story points of the backlog of the user story here is just 5, then we can up till we have filled up our capacity of 42 and user storage points. And as long as we've just filled up the capacity, and we had all our discussions already in the backlog refinement. And that does not make sense, because we know that the product owner is allowed to change the prioritization of the backlog item as long as he is going to the sprint planning 1. And it might be the case that he says, well, this now is for some reasons much more important than this one. And then you might not have talked about that specific item at the beginning, or he comes up with completely new items because someone in his departments started to say it's more important than that. Okay? So stick to the idea, the real conversation, what we will do in a sprint stays in sprint planning 1, and this is the meeting where we really talk about features in detail and only talk about roughly the size of a user story to identify if that user story is a small user story, a medium-sized user story, and a large user story. And if you identify that the next user story that you have to do is a large user story, well, then split it and create based on a large user story, a small user story, or a small backlog item. That's for now. Thanks for listening and watching my small tutorial about backlog refinement. Have fun and try it out.